Okay, let us begin. Today's Torah portion, this week's Torah portion, Vayechi, is the final chapters of the book of Genesis. And it's also the final chapters of the life of our ancestor Jacob, Yisrael, after whom the Jewish people are named. And Jacob is the most colorful, perhaps, the most colorfully described of our ancestors. And his life is the most diverse in its, maybe equal to Abraham, but nonetheless, the Jacob's life is very full, and he experiences a lot of different things. And this final chapter of his life ends describing the hours, days before his death, or before the end of his earthly life. And overall, Yaakov's life can be divided into three eras. First era of Yaakov's life, the Torah describes him as being Ish Tam Yoshev Ohalim, a simple man dwelling in tents. And this, if we picture it, what that looks like, we have a vision of Yaakov the scholar, who is enjoying the solitude of meditation and study, and who is really a career academic. But of course, there is no such thing as academia for the Jew, because the Torah is a Torah of life. And thus, our study is not theoretical. It is always life-changing. If it isn't life-changing, life-affirming, then it isn't true Torah study. Torah means teaching, not study. And teaching means a guide. So during this time, Yaakov is in the tents of Torah, in the environment of study and of self-improvement, perhaps of mystical meditation. And he's also at home in the embrace of his family with his mother and his father. Okay, there's a brother he doesn't quite get along with, it seems, but they have a relationship. That's the first era of Yaakov's life. Idyllic is the word I would use to describe it. Idyllic. As a matter of fact, almost nothing is known about that time in his life, except for how that time came to an end. The second era of Yaakov's life is his time in Haran. After leaving home to build his own home, to start a family, he lives with his father-in-law Lavan, for whom he works. And this is described by Yaakov himself as a time of struggle. It's a time in which he is oppressed by the heat during the day and the cold at night, in which he never has a good night's sleep in over 20 years, and in which he's dealing with an employer, his father-in-law, which is a complicated relationship enough, but he's dealing with an employer that, by Yaakov's estimation, is cheating him at every turn and seeking to manipulate him and um, uh, and to take advantage of him. And in this episode of Yaakov's life, he is actually particularly productive. He becomes materially wealthy, and he marries, has 12 children, and at the end of this episode, in the famous and mystical depiction of his battle with the man at night, with the angel of Esav, as the rabbis characterize it, the angel tells him, "You are called Yisrael because you have struggled with God and with man, and you have prevailed." And so this is a time that is particularly difficult and also particularly productive. The third, after that time with Lavan in Haran, Yaakov returns back home to Israel, to Hebron, to his childhood home for some time, during which time, of course, his son Yosef goes missing, which we've discussed. But after this comes, it's essentially a return, in some ways, to the first era. And after this, we have the third era, which is Yaakov's time in Egypt. Yaakov lives in Egypt for 17 years, where he passes away. Now, how did Yaakov feel about living in Egypt? At the very beginning of our reading today, we see Yaakov describe his last wish, a wish that is so important to him that he requires Yosef to swear to it, to swear that he'll fulfill it. Now, you imagine a father on his deathbed asking his son to do something. That in itself is a powerful statement. And here, not only is this the last thing he can think of, it's something that he feels compelled to compel Yosef to keep. And that is, don't allow me to be buried in Egypt. Bury me back in my hometown, in my childhood home at Hebron. Now, what does that say about how Yaakov feels about living in Egypt? It seems to me that this describes a man who feels utterly displaced, Now, in a sense, it might be described as the best time in Yaakov's life, second only to the idyllic period of his youth, the first period of his life in which he uh, is a full-time scholar. Here, it may be second to that, but it may even be better than that. Here he is surrounded by a loving family, his children reunited, his son Yosef no longer lost, and now the viceroy of Egypt. They enjoy material wealth, political influence, and a sense of togetherness that they haven't had, that they've only had for the most brief of times. And so, while that time, this time in Egypt, could be described as the best, in a sense, Yaakov feels utterly displaced. So much so that even as he dies, he says, I want to make sure that I'm not buried here because this is not where I belong. This is not where we belong. And it seems to me that these three eras describe three mind states that we can experience in our spiritual life. There is the idyllic period. The idyllic period in which we feel spiritually connected and truth is all around us and we are confident of truth. We have certainty, spiritual certainty. We have the second type of mind space, which is struggle, in which we are confronting obstacles and challenges, in which we feel oppressed, taken advantage of. And these moments we can confront. The purpose of struggle is so that we confront the struggle and do our best to maintain our integrity despite the challenges that we face. This is a time of challenge and struggle. So far we have the idyllic mind state of spiritual certainty. We have the challenged and struggling mind state in which we are facing difficult circumstances toward which we have to maintain our integrity and stay true. And then there is the third of spiritual displacement, in which everything technically is right, but we still somehow, everything materially is right, and even on a spiritual sense, may be doing well, but we are not masters of our circumstances. We realize that we are confronting a system that is far beyond anything that we could imagine confronting. During this period of time, Yosef, while he enjoys such political influence, is still a vassal to Pharaoh. He is ultimately an employee, even still a slave. A slave with influence, a slave with comforts, but he has to ask Paro permission before fulfilling his father's last wish. And so, he doesn't even, if you look at the chapter 50, verse 4, Yosef speaks to the house of Paro, requesting, please speak in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, my father has made me swear that I would bury him in our ancestral lands. I will bury my father and return. And so you see, here is a man who doesn't have freedom of movement. So, this gives us a hint to chapter 50, verse 4. Right there, you passed it. Go back one page. Previous page, right there, verse 4. So this is a time, so this gives us an insight into how, while there is not necessarily a sense of struggle, a sense of the challenge that he had in the house of Haran, you see, the thing is, when we have challenges, when we have struggles, there is some power in struggle. There is some autonomy in struggle. When we are dealing with an individual who mistreats us, we can make choices. When we are facing internal struggles and personal challenges, we can make choices, and we always have our free choice. And so while it's a painful, challenging time, we are still in the driver's seat. But in the era of displacement, that which is spiritually oppressive is so beyond our control. All of the forces in the universe conspire to make it not the way it's supposed to be, it seems to us. You think about the circumstances that caused Yaakov to be where he was, all of them out of his control. His children's interactions, decisions that they made when he wasn't present, bad choices of his children. And then circumstances outside of his son Yosef's control. Yosef there's all these machinations that happen that Yaakov had nothing to do with. And then there's the weather. The weather is one of the biggest influencers in Yaakov's life, in the sense that because of this famine, this natural circumstance, so we have a social and political and natural universe all conspiring to bring Yaakov to the land of Egypt and to keep him there. And he feels all of this time displaced from his home. Now, I just want to again contrast the time of displacement with the time of struggle. If Yaakov had died in Haran, it is unlikely, seems to me unlikely, that he would have asked to be buried in Hebron, that he would have asked his body to be transported to Hebron. Why do I say this? Because his beloved wife, Rachel, passes away as they journey from Haran to Hebron, from the land of Laban, to his childhood home. And she's buried there on the way. B'derech Efrat Beit Lachem, near Bethlehem. And so this was a land in which Yaakov would have been buried. Even in the land of struggle, he would have been okay to be buried, but not in the land of Egypt. So in the land of challenge and struggle was not his problem, because this wasn't his, this while difficult, still always gave him a choice. But this land, the land of displacement, is one in which he has no choices. As a matter of fact, everything which he can choose is beautiful. Again, he has his family. He has a successful son who is taking care of the family. They have material wealth, and they even have the opportunity for Torah study, presided over by Yehuda, by Judah. And really, the dream of many people of how one would die is peacefully in bed, surrounded by his children. And so, in this era, he has so many beautiful things, and yet some things that are so meaningful to him are completely outside of his control. And so I think that and yet the Torah describes Yaakov as living in the land of Egypt. Vayechi Yaakov b'Eretz Mitzrayim 17 shana. Yaakov lived for 17 years in the land of Egypt. And the rabbis say that when the Torah writes, and he lived in the land of Egypt, it means that he really thrived in the land of Egypt. And so it seems to me that Yaakov might be giving us hope and confidence that in any one of these circumstances in which we find ourselves, in any meaningful circumstance that we find ourselves, if we find ourselves in the idyllic spiritual zone, that's wonderful. But you know, these moments, while they happen to us, don't always last. There isn't much to talk about. That idyllic time, those idyllic moments of spiritual certainty are perhaps evidence that deep down we are really spiritually connected, and we have a very powerful and true spiritual presence in us. And sometimes we're aware of it, and sometimes we're more aware of it, sometimes we're less aware of it. So this is regarding the idyllic era. We have, if you've seen it once, it means it was always there, because God is truth. And if it's there, if you saw it, that means it's always there. And then there's the time of challenge and struggle, when we face difficulties. And perhaps what Yaakov is calling to remind us is that this was the most productive period of his life. And that as we face challenges and struggles, we are given the opportunity to fight back by maintaining our integrity and by struggling against God and man and prevailing. Or struggling with God and men and prevailing. And then, if we feel displaced, Yaakov says, I've been there too. I too have faced a time in which I felt that everything was not right and it was completely beyond my control. That there are forces that don't make sense, that are outside of my ability to do anything about, that are determining my fate. And I think that politically and socially, and even on our most basic levels of health, many people feel that way today. Like, we have so much good, and yet there are many important things that we wish would be a certain way that are not, and it's just outside of our control. There are forces and circumstances that they're done behind our back, out not in our presence, and not necessarily with our consent, that will determine significantly the way in which we will live. And so Yaakov says, I've been there too. And I managed to thrive there too. And you know, it got worse before it got better. But in the end, the children of Yaakov, the children of Yisrael, left Egypt b'rechush gadol, with great wealth. So, know that we have a soul that is certain of truth. Know that struggle and challenge can be the most productive time in our life. And know that even as we are spiritually displaced, it may get worse before it gets better. But in the end, it is the circumstance which will result in rechush gadol, great wealth, which for the children of Israel meant that they were shaped as a nation during this time. The children of Israel became the nation of Israel in Egypt. And we became the recipients of the Torah immediately following Egypt. And so, while certainly it was Yaakov's feeling of displacement was only a shadow, a glimmer of what was to come for the children of Israel, of being completely out of control, not in control of their environment, to the point of oppression and slavery. But ultimately, he's been there too, and is calling on us to give us hope, and to let us know that even there, God is with us.